Imagine you're President of the United States. Your advisors come to you with a plan to overthrow a hostile government that threatens American security. The plan would solve a major problem if it worked, but you worry that it won't. What do you do? I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is the Bay of Pigs invasion, which began on April 17, 1961. The road to the Bay of Pigs began 2 years earlier when Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's U.S.-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Relations between the two countries quickly soured. Castro denounced decades of U.S. political and economic domination of Cuba. He called for revolutions throughout Latin America, and he seized properties that U.S. firms owned in Cuba. What especially worried Washington, though, was Castro's growing ties to Moscow. It was the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union looked to be on the march around the globe. So President Dwight Eisenhower and his advisors looked at Castro in fear that the Soviets would soon have a beachhead less than 100 miles off America's shores. By March 1960, Eisenhower had had enough. He authorized a CIA plan to train Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. The plan, eventually codenamed Bumpy Road, rested on the premise that the attack by Cuban exiles would trigger a popular uprising in Cuba that would overthrow Castro. Eisenhower had reason to be confident that the plan would work. 6 years earlier, the Central Intelligence Agency had engineered the ouster of a leftist government in Guatemala. Operation Bumpy Road could not be executed before Eisenhower left office. The decision on whether to proceed was left to his successor, John F. Kennedy. JFK had doubts about the wisdom of Operation Bumpy Road. He knew that a decision to intervene overtly in Cuba would be criticized at home and especially abroad. But he also knew that ousting Castro would fulfill his campaign promise of a tougher foreign policy and strengthen his hand in dealing with the Soviets. And he saw real political cost to killing the operation. Some of the hundreds of Cuban exiles, and probably a few U.S. government officials as well, would complain to the press that he had walked away from the plan that would have toppled Castro. That would have exposed JFK to damaging charges that he was soft on communism. So JFK gave a green light to Operation Bumpy Road, but in doing so he made two critical decisions. First, because he wanted to minimize overt U.S. involvement, he severely limited the U.S. air support for the mission. CIA and U.S. Air Force officials went along with the restriction because they assumed he would change his mind if the operation ran into trouble. Second, he chose a more remote landing site for the operation, the Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, it was a lousy spot for an amphibious landing. The invasion force of 1,511 exiles, known as Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. The operation was a disaster from the start. Castro's army wasn't surprised, ordinary Cubans did not rise up in revolt, and JFK refused to send the U.S. military to save the Cuban exiles pinned down on the beaches. On April 19th, Brigade 2506 surrendered. The 3 days of fighting had left 140 exiles dead and nearly 1,200 captured.
Before jumping into the details of the Bay of Pigs invasion, I want to make sure we understand the environment in Cuba and the United States leading up to the invasion. So, going into the late 1950s, Cuba was controlled by this guy right over here, Batista. And he was a dictator that was supported by the United States. And just to give a sense of what he was like, here's a quote from John F. Kennedy in 1963. So this is after he's already had the Bay of Pigs has happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis has happened. He is not a big fan of Fidel Castro. But with that said, in hindsight, JFK did say this, and this is, I think, a pretty objective assessment of what Batista was like as the dictator of Cuba. This is John F. Kennedy saying this. I believe there's no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. So even John F. Kennedy, in hindsight, is saying that Batista really was not was really not the best person, and it really was not a good idea for the United States to support such a corrupt dictator for so long in Cuba. And this is Batista right over here riding with some U.S. generals in a parade when he visited D.C. So you can imagine he was not a popular person in control of Cuba. And in 1959, you have a successful revolution against him. 1959, there is a revolution. And the revolution is led by this character, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro and his kind of number two, his right hand men are Raúl Castro and Che Guevara right over here. And they take control of Cuba. They're part of this nationalist revolutionary movement. Now, the one thing they do, and they are leaning from the beginning. People assume that they are maybe communist or quasi-communist. But even from the get-go, as soon as they take power, they start taking over lands that were owned by, well, one that was private property, private Cuban property, some of it that was United States property. Their argument would have probably been that this was wealth, that this was private property that was ill-gotten, that was gotten in the time of Batista. But they did it on in a broad sweep. So they took over a lot of private land, a lot of private property, which also led to people thinking that, hey, this is not just a nationalist revolution, this is also a communist revolution. But you could also imagine that once they take over, there's this huge migration of Cubans to the United States, and it's primarily middle class, upper middle class Cubans, educated Cubans, who are really afraid of what Fidel Castro is doing in terms of taking over private land, taking people's property. So you start having this Cuban exiled community really focused around Florida and mainly Miami, and they're still there. And they're very unhappy with this Fidel Castro character right over here. So when we fast forward into 1961, John F. Kennedy becomes president. He gets elected in 1960, becomes president in early 1961. We're now fast forwarding to April 1961. So John F. Kennedy has only been president for a few months. But you can imagine on a lot of levels, you have all of these Cuban exiles, upper middle class, educated, middle class Cuban exiles who hate Fidel Castro. He's taking over their land. He's turning it into looks like a leftist state. This is all happening within the context of the Cold War. The United States is afraid of countries falling to communism. It looks like Fidel Castro is a communist. So the United States, besides the fact that you have all of these exiles who want to oust him, the United States probably wants to oust him just because he's a communist, and they're afraid that he's going to align himself with the Soviet Union. So, in conjunction with the Cuban exiles and the CIA, and this right here is the director of Central Intelligence during the Kennedy administration, or at least the beginning part of the Kennedy administration. This is Allen Dulles. His brother is John Foster Dulles. That Dulles Airport is named after, and he was a U.S. Secretary of State. They decide that they want to oust Fidel Castro, but they want to do it in a way. They wanted to do it in a way that the United States does not look like it's the one doing the invasion. So what they do is they plan an invasion where they'll take Cuban exiles, and they get 1,400 men to sign up. So 1,400 exiled Cubans to sign up to be kind of part of this CIA-backed, US-backed force to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. And a lot of this was based on the premise, and you can imagine this, and this even happened in the Iraq War, where the CIA, the American president, they kind of surround themselves with people who tell them, one, give them a very optimistic scenario, a very hopeful scenario, telling them, look, we represent what the rest of the Cuban people want. They'll say, look, if we just start a revolution, Fidel Castro will be overthrown. The reality that came out, at least at that point in time, in the early 1960s, Fidel Castro was actually pretty popular with the Cuban people, and you can imagine he was at that time pretty popular with the poor people who did not have land. And now all of a sudden you have this I guess you could call him leader for the people. And I don't know about his popularity now, but at that point he was probably a lot more popular than the exiles and the CIA would have had Kennedy believe. And so they plan this attack. Kennedy says, oh, if we can get rid of Fidel Castro, then that de-risks the possibility of having this communist nation right off of the Florida coast. So they planned this invasion, and it's shady to begin with because they didn't want to make it look like an official U.S. invasion. They wanted to make it look like it was a pure Cuban counter-revolutionary, and to some degree that really kind of mixed up everything and made it look well, and it really was suspect because they really were doing something that was not what it really was. But the invasion, the way it all worked out is that by April 15th, on April 15th, and this is just going into the details of the invasion. So they had the 1,400 exiles. They had some ships, some planes. They marked them. They either removed the markings so that it didn't look like they were American ships or planes, or they put markings. They put false markings of the Cuban military so that it would cause some confusion or whatever. And so on April 15th, 1961, and remember this is only a few months into Kennedy's administration, they start air attacks, and these air attacks launch from Nicaragua, and they go to Cuba, and the whole point of these air attacks are to kind of soften the Cuban Air Force for an eventual invasion by the 1,400 exiles. And so you have 8 aircraft, 8 bombers leaving Nicaragua. They bomb Cuba at a base outside of Havana, and a base near the south, actually not too far from current Guantanamo Bay. And the point, and their goal was to destroy the Cuban Air Force. It turns out they didn't do it. And once again, they did it to kind of cause confusion. They did it under the markings not of U.S. bombers, but they put Cuban Air Force markings on the planes to cause confusion. You had 8 planes going and doing the bombings. One of them gets shot down, and a 9th plane actually leaves from Nicaragua, and they falsely put bullet holes in it to look like it was hit with anti-aircraft guns, and had it defect to Florida. So I guess the idea behind this was to make it look like there's a Cuban pilot who takes off from Cuba or somehow gets out of Cuba with a Cuban plane. That's why they put the markings there, and then tries to destroy a bunch of Cuban aircraft, and then defects to the United States. That's the impression that they wanted to convey. It's not so clear that the Cubans actually fell for it. And so that happened in 1961. Most everyone kind of saw this as a U.S. attack, or at least said they viewed it as a U.S. attack. And then you fast forward to the night of April 16th, which I haven't written over here. April 16th. And this whole time, everyone was expecting a U.S. attack. And this is one of the things that it all gets, it all leads to the fact this was not a well orchestrated series of events, is that it's pretty well established that some of these exiles, were just not as tight-lipped as they should have been about the invasion. It got out. It got to Soviet intelligence. The Cubans knew that an invasion was imminent. So on April 16th, you have kind of a false attack, a decoy attack at Bahia Honda right over here, which really just a bunch of decoy boats with loudspeakers on them that made it sound like they were firing and to cause confusion. And it did temporarily cause Castro to look in that direction because they were kind of on hair trigger notice, expecting an imminent invasion, but that wasn't the real one. This was on the evening of April 16th. But then when you go to the early morning of April 17th, you have the real invasion, where you have the 1,400 Cuban exiles with CIA and U.S. military support, but all of that was hidden, to actually invade at the Bay of Pigs. And this right here is the Bay of Pigs. And to make a long story short, it was kind of the invasion did not go well, and it has been blamed on bad planning, on incompetence on some parts of the invasion. If the invasion lasted from April 17th, this was the first day of the invasion, but by April 19th, essentially the invading force, the counter-revolutionary force, the 1,400 Cuban exiles had been pushed back to the beaches. And for the most part, a little over 100 of them were killed, and most of them, over 1,000 of them, were captured. So over 1,000 captured. And then later on in the year, Fidel Castro, and some were executed after being captured, but later on in the year, Fidel Castro makes a deal with the United States where he hands over the captured exiles to the United States in exchange for $58 million in aid and supplies and all the rest. So this, at least from a military point of view, was a complete debacle from the United States point of view. And when you can imagine after this happened, people in the United States started pointing fingers. You have the CIA, and this is Alan Dulles right here, and the exiles blaming the Kennedy administration, saying that, look, he wasn't willing to do what it takes to actually do a proper invasion. He wasn't willing to provide the proper air support once the invasion started happening. He wasn't willing to commit more U.S. troops once the invasion started looking like it wasn't going in the direction of the exiles. Kennedy, on the other hand, blames the CIA. He says, look, this was just done. This was planned incompetently. And he also says that you gave me all sorts of misinformation. You told me that once the invasion started, that there was all sorts of resentment against Fidel Castro and it would cause this broader uprising, which never ever happened. And so this is actually a quote from John F. Kennedy that he said after the Bay of Pigs invasion: "The first advice I'm going to give my successors to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn." This is John F. Kennedy saying this after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, you can dig deeper and figure out who probably was in the right here. But the bottom line is that it led to all-round negative consequences for the United States. After this, it kind of strengthened Fidel Castro's hold on Cuba. He was like, hey, that was the United States' best shot. Huge embarrassment for them. It allowed him to concentrate his control. It also caused him to now become very openly communist. And also, he was now, before the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was kind of trying to get the U.S. to somewhat like him, although they wouldn't like him because he was taking over private property and he was clearly left-leaning. But after the Bay of Pigs invasion, he definitely aligned himself closely with the Soviet Union. He became much more open about being a Marxist-Leninist communist state. And because he was afraid of future U.S. invasions, he was open to what eventually leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the Soviet Union actually placing ballistic missiles, with nuclear warheads in Cuba at short range to the United States. So it set up this whole series of events that really didn't work in the U.S.'s favor.
In 1962, the Cold War was heating up in America's backyard. Since aligning himself with the Soviet Union, Cuban dictator Fidel Castro was an object of growing U.S. concern. A failed attempt to oust him from power in April 1961 through the use of Cuban exile forces emboldened both Castro and his Kremlin supporters. In May 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered to install offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Castro readily agreed, viewing the missiles as a deterrent against another U.S. attempt to force him from power. Missiles began to arrive that summer under the tightest secrecy. Khrushchev's plan depended on getting the missiles operational before the Americans discovered they were there. But U.S. intelligence quickly learned that something unusual was afoot on the island nation. In early October, U-2 and Navy reconnaissance flights provided alarming but conclusive evidence that the Soviets were constructing missile launch sites throughout Cuba. President Kennedy immediately assembled his national security team, including military members of the Joint Staff, to determine a course of action. After several days in which all the options were weighed, the administration announced a strict naval quarantine of Cuba, in which U.S. Navy ships would prevent any further offensive military weapons from being delivered to Cuba.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
While this policy was deemed less risky than a full-scale strike against Cuba, it was not without risk. A blockade was, after all, an act of war. But by calling it a quarantine and limiting it to offensive military weapons, the U.S. gained support from key Allied governments. "It looks like it's up to the Navy," Kennedy said to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George W. Anderson. "Mr. President, the Navy will not let you down," Anderson replied. Indeed, the burden fell squarely on the U.S. Navy. Naval forces under U.S. Atlantic Command, headed by Admiral Robert L. Dennison, steamed out to sea, intercepting not only merchant shipping en route to Cuba, but Soviet submarines operating in the area as well. One of the first destroyers on the scene, USS Blandy, diligently tracked a Soviet Foxtrot submarine, eventually forcing it to surface. We now know these submarines were carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes and were the spearhead of a Soviet effort to establish a naval base on Cuba. U.S. destroyers maintained the quarantine. Radar picket ships supported by Navy fighters and airborne early warning planes assisted the U.S. Air Force's Air Defense Command in preparing to defend American airspace from Soviet and Cuban forces. The aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and Marine forces of the Second Fleet under Vice Admiral Alfred G. Ward were poised to launch air, naval gunfire, and amphibious strikes against Soviet and Cuban forces ashore if the quarantine failed. For 13 days in late October, the world held its breath.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The Soviet ships turned back. The crisis was over. Khrushchev, faced with the armed might of the United States and its allies, had little choice but to find some way out of the difficult situation in which he had placed himself and his country. President Kennedy did not press the advantage that the strength of U.S. and Allied naval and military forces gave him. That allowed the Soviet leader to peacefully disengage his nation from this most serious of confrontations. For the rest of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union never again reached the brink of what would have been a world-altering nuclear conflict.
Mariel Boatlift, Freedom Flotilla. Currently, in the country of Cuba, immigration policies are extremely strict, but in the year 1980 there was a moment in history where these policies were temporarily lifted, and here is how it all began. The year was 1980. We are currently in the country of Cuba. The dictator at the time was Fidel Castro. Fidel is a cruel and extremely strict dictator, especially when it comes to anyone entering or leaving his country. The process of leaving Cuba, even if you have family in another country, is incredibly difficult. Most stories on leaving Cuba vary anywhere from 3 weeks to a year.
There are many different theories on how the 1980 refugee exodus began, but one of the most recognized was April 11th when a Miami radio station started a broadcast that said for all Cuban Americans to gather and sail to the limits of Cuban waters, which was 90 nautical miles from the coast of Florida. This was done to bring pressure and awareness to the wrongs of Fidel Castro's immigration policies.
After this incident, things began to escalate rapidly. On April 21st, a station in Cuba called Radio Havana announced that they would let 2 small craft ships come to pick up refugees as long as they were related to someone aboard the ship. Upon returning, the ship broke down 2 miles before land and was towed to Key West. Coast Guards towed them into port. The next day, refugees from these ships in interviews said that Cuba had opened its borders for anyone that wanted to leave, as long as they had a permit.
Soon after that day, 4 ships carrying 348 Cubans landed in Florida. Meanwhile, more than 50 crafts were spotted leaving Key West. About 50 ships were leaving Miami, and another 50 ships were leaving Fowey Rocks. All of them were headed for Cuba. On April 24th, numerous boats waited in line to be launched at Key West. Each boat was about 20 to 40 feet in length and were not meant for this type of travel. Most of the boats had inadequate fuel capacities. Even though there was a great risk, they set sail for Cuba anyways. The launching of ships lasted about 48 hours, and by the end of the night, 1,000 to 1,200 set sail for Port Mariel. The next day, a massive amount of Cuban Americans lined up at Key West. These people were shipless and arrived there to try and buy a boat and hire a captain. Those who managed to do this had no care for the risk, on top of the fact that they were completely unexperienced. Due to this, many of the boats required assistance, or worse, sunk. The amount of ships that left for departure were much more than the amount of ships that returned. The Coast Guard had issued many search and rescue missions to find and tow boats back to Key West. However, there were only 12 serious cases where ships sunk. Other shipless Cuban Americans paid commercial crafts such as shrimp boats to sail back to Cuba to pick up relatives. Reports say that captains of these commercial ships were charging up to $1,000 a person. The departure of ships going to pick up refugees stayed the same until about April 27th. There was a mini hurricane that passed through which led to 22 life-threatening incidents in only 5 minutes. Fortunately, the storm passed by quick. Cutters, the naval ship used to tow small crafts, were able to respond an hour after the storm. The weather was a mere holdup in the amount of Cubans emigrating to America. By the 29th of April, the exodus was again in full operation. Though, as the number of ships waiting to departure began increasing, the amount of people returning was not. The time in which it took to be processed and leave was becoming a much harder and tedious process, partly because of the mass amount of lifts coming in to retrieve large amounts of people. But this problem came mostly from Cuba, causing many setbacks, saying that they would not allow boats to departure until money was wired over to Cuba. They were also overplying ship supplies, making it more difficult for people to get what they needed to leave. Of the 188 boats that set sail to Cuba, 84 of these ships returned with no refugees. Besides these difficulties, the refugee exodus seemed to be running very smoothly. But on May 5th, an ocean-going tug named Cape Gull escorted the ship Dr. Daniels back to Key West. Dr. Daniels had 449 immigrants aboard the vessel and only enough safety equipment for about 150 people. Right after this incident, the boat Ingham heard that a 150-foot boat named America's was to carry 900 passengers back to Key West. The following telex was then sent to Cuba. It stated that Cuba needed to depart in contravention of Safety of Life at Sea Convention, SOLAS, 1960. In the telex, it also looked for Cuba to start documenting ship names and the amount of people aboard each ship. Cuba took this very lightly and still sent overloaded ships. The 7th District Coast Guard decided to have cutters on patrol to help escort refugees from overloaded ships on a 24-hour basis. Towards the middle of June, the amount of people emigrating to America during the Mariel boat lift began to trickle, and eventually came to a stop. This was the end of one of the world's largest known immigrations in history. The total amount of boats used in the Exodus of 1980 tops off at 5,000 ships,